Okay, back on the show today, Jamie McHugh. So interdisciplinary artist, somatic movement specialist, nature connection, obviously somatic meditation. Someone I've studied with a little bit personally, like his work, hard to pin down, but very welcome back. Jamie, welcome.
Welcome. For better or worse, hard to pin down. I like that.
It's usually a good thing. I'm not interesting people normally are. Let's hear a little bit about your story. We always start there. How did you get into what you do now?
That could take the whole hour, but suffice it to say, a lot of synchronicity, a lot of following my curiosity, showing up in different places at different times, a trajectory, I'd say, from starting with dance improvisation. I know we all come into the somatic world from different purviews. And for me, it was through dance improvisation and little by little creative dance, working in schools with kids for many years, for 7 years, then moving to the West Coast, to California to apprentice with Anna Halprin, which was kind of continuing that trajectory, but not only of dance for performance, but dance as a healing art and dance as a way to plumb the depths of our being through internal movement meditations. And then from there, taking that out into the environment, the natural environment. Anna was the first person I studied with who would bring us to the beach for a month. And we'd work out in the sand and in the elements, which of course creates a whole different valence of experience. But also through being in California, exploring the different somatic teachers, that whole world that was happening in the Bay Area in the late 80s, early 90s. So, people like Bonnie Bainbridge Cohen, Emilie Conrad. So I'd say that my trajectory over time has really been starting with dance. And in a way, I'd say I still dance, but in a way that many people wouldn't consider dance. But for me, it is about moving energy through the body. It's about spontaneous response and particularly engagement from that, I'd say, the beginner's mind that we see in how infants and young children move, right? That freedom of affect and perception and movement, really.
And fortunate to be in one of those kind of epicenters of the somatic world. I remember kind of being a kid at that time and sort of looking across and going, wow, there's all this stuff going on in the States and there's a lot less going on here. There were some things in the UK, there was always things there in Europe. And now, of course, people can just go online and get access to it.
Right.
It wasn't that, Bonnie, for example, teaches online now.
Right.
She didn't till pretty recently. I had to go film her in California. And it was,
right.
It's a very different world now. I wonder how that's going to be now. What you had geographically has now opened up to the world.
Mm-hmm.
But then there's this environmental part, like we can't all go dance on the beach together.
Right.
And that environmental part is not nothing, right? That's pretty big, that environmental impact, shared space. So we don't have that.
Well, of course, the natural environment is everywhere. And so, for example, like this summer, I'm going to be back teaching in the Alps in Switzerland, which I haven't done for 4 years. I'm very excited about it. But I've been in the forests of Oregon, of France, of Germany, of course, coastal California. So, yeah, as with any environment, there's always trade-offs, what you can experience. But the earth is a profound teacher in terms of being a body. And for me, that's that whole connection and kinship with place, I think, is an important frontier that will help change our consciousness about how we live on the earth, right? I mean, think about it. Nature can be scenery. It can be like the backdrop for our internal dramas, right? But sometimes to open perception and really understand the world's wisdom traditions have always been in concert with the natural environment. And when you look back at the ancient Chinese philosophers, there's always this sense of the earth is fundamental to our consciousness. And of course, as we become more urbanized, it's easy to lose sight of that. But the earth not only needs our stewardship now, and particularly to advocate for all other life forms that we share the planet with, but there is also a reciprocity. There's something that tree and river and rock can offer us as somas. And I think that's really important in terms of the embodiment movement, that we don't lose track of context and reciprocal information.
Yeah, I think it's potentially a risk. I've always tried to make, a track for this in our work. Like, we have a festival coming up, and I've invited Philip Shepherd, David Abrams. We've invited to stuff, Charles Eisenstein. I've always tried to invite these people to our events. At least one person that represents this kind of way of looking at things. In that, I think it was always missing a bit from a lot of embodiment. It's interesting. The founder of Aikido, for example, said you should do Aikido outside as much as possible. And everyone in Tokyo just ignored that and made a concrete monstrosity, and everyone practiced inside. And Anna Halprin had her deck, and everyone dances on her deck. But most 5 rhythms is done inside, for example. Right. And there's just practical reasons for that quite often.
Sure.
Yoga, I see yoga on the beach occasionally, but generally classes are done in the studio. And again, particularly in rainy old England, unless it's summer, and you can do yoga in the park, but then maybe people come up to you. It's not so much fun. There's practical reasons why. And then with the technology, maybe that's even, as someone who's run, big online events. Right. I realized the other day on my podcast, there was a Pedro Paz, a dancer from Portugal, was the first person I interviewed outside in 450 episodes. He was sat there with his phone outside in Walsh or somewhere beautiful. So I do worry that we kind of almost encouraging, now we have to have a laptop and a phone, that makes it even more difficult for us to be outside, and we're not in shared space. So I kind of wonder how we can bring this element in.
Sure. Well, so in relation to that, and I know this is kind of an odd thing to say, the pandemic that kind of shifted people online was one of the best things for me for the development of my work, because I would go places and teach, but then I might not see those students for another year or so. But all of a sudden, it becoming normalized to share space online, it really allowed my teaching to go deeper and deeper, and that there's a lot of pluses to virtual teaching, particularly in terms of, the way I teach. I have camera off for people, muted, guide them on a journey. So in that sense, there's not the social restrictions of, am I bothering somebody if I make a sound? Am I impinging on somebody else's experience? So there really is a way that people can fully drop into their own experience in a safe environment, right? The safety of their own home that's hopefully safe. But anyway, so that has been really powerful. But I also tried last year for the first time doing Somatic Expression in Nature as an online course. So we would gather online, but then people would have scores and activities to do in their own domain, in their own ecosystem. So we've had people who were in the desert, in the woods, by the ocean. I mean, it was really interesting, the various environments that people were, in a sense, really claiming as their own and then coming back. So there is a way to encourage that. I agree. It's harder. But I think there is a way to, for me, it's a work in progress. How do I transmit something that I've been doing 30 years in person into a virtual experience? And particularly, how do people really, in a sense, land in their own ecosystem? Right? Because it's one thing, I'm going to fly to California, roll around on the beach, but then I'm going to come back to rainy old England. How do I translate that experience into my ecosystem? So I think that's part of the challenge right now. How do we land in our own ecosystem and fully appreciate it?
As you mentioned, there could be greater safety there. There could be greater sort of transfer compared to, I go to a workshop in Eslan and it's just a separate thing over there. So, continuity of relationship. I love that I can WhatsApp call my students. I must have sent WhatsApp messages or had WhatsApp calls with people in 10 countries today. And it's not anyone much,
Right.
I could be walking through the woods while on a call with someone walking in the snow in Canada, that's a pretty cool thing that happened. And the other one that's interesting is it can drop things right into life. So we did a bunch of little one-to-one meditation sessions because I like your work, and it was almost to force me to meditate in the day. So usually I manage a good practice in the morning, and then I sort of, my day gets accelerated like today. And we'd have these little half-hour windows, and it was very interesting to me because of Zoom. I didn't have any. I could literally be in a marketing meeting going 1,000 miles an hour. Go right. It's 11. It's 12:30. Hang up the call and be on a call with you 30 seconds later. And it really was boom. The practice got put right into my life. And often, if you remember, I'd come to those calls usually they were afternoon time because of the time.
Right.
So I'd had 8 or 9 hours of work to get papanchit, the Buddhists would say, to get accelerated and proliferated. And then it was bam, I was in a meditation. I didn't even have the half-hour walk to the Brighton Buddhist Center. 20 minutes cycling to yoga. They didn't even have that. It was literally change Zoom room. And it was sort of abrasive and abrupt, but at the same time, it was wow, it's pretty interesting to just drop meditation into my online life like that.
Right. And, it's like some of the things you're mentioning, kind of accessibility, what I would call the ecology, in the sense of I don't have to drive anywhere. I don't have to go anywhere, that I can just be right here and drop in. And I think that accessibility is what's really useful for people. I mean, especially so, for example, like the Thinking Body series I'm doing is, basically lying down, really getting horizontal, exploring subtle movement, breath, kind of going on a somatic journey. And by the end of the 75 minutes, I think it's kind of great that people are in their own homes. I wouldn't want them driving, but also there's an ease of transition from this depth experience into being in one's environment again. And I know that can probably, add to alienation or isolation. At the same time, I've been aware how these online communities are very vibrant. People have been really surprised how intimate it can be and how there really is, a shared feeling, an empathic response to other people's experiences. So, so I'm the jury's out. I'm still kind of working with, how do we assimilate this and really think of it as a new pedagogical experience that we need to fine tune and look at, as well as how do we continue to show up with each other in real time.
It's interesting in 12-step in addiction recovery. I go to meetings now. A lot of people come back to face-to-face meetings, and there's some combination. It's really nice that I can keep in contact with meetings in Brighton when I'm in Portugal or whatever. But they call them Zoom babies, people who've only known online. And some of the Zoom babies are going into face-to-face meetings for the first time, after 2 years. 2 years of sobriety. And there'll be Zoom babies from the somatic world who maybe, I have messages, people say, hey, I discovered Embodiment 2 years ago at the conference. And since then, I've been doing online classes from, the arse end of Ohio or wherever they happen to be. And it's wow, we've got Embodiment Zoom babies now.
Right.
That's very different than someone in California dancing on the beach without a Halprin,
Right. And, I was also thinking about, the proliferation of all of this stuff online, and it almost, talk about the tendency to want to do it all, like the shift network and this and that, and I'm going to take in this information, take in that information. And it can become like a candy store, right? We're just going to kind of, at a certain point, how do we modulate all of that input and really, in a sense, find our own path and perhaps our own practice and discipline? And for me, I'd say that's really important, that I want to encourage repetition, deepening, easing into practice little by little. That for me, it's like a student of mine said the other day that I really appreciated. She should have said, what I appreciate about you is you're not a guru. You're not telling me what to do. You're giving me these tools and resources and really empowering me to start making decisions and following my own path. And for me, that's the most I can hope for. That what happens is that people feel empowered, liberated, and that their curiosity and creativity is coming into the foreground, so they're not reliant on me. And I don't want that kind of dependency. And even though it's good for business, I don't want that dependency and reliance. So,
a couple of issues there. We've sort of turned, and I'm partially responsible to this, we've sort of turned the whole world into the Bay Area in terms of, the sweet shop of possibilities, right? I remember friends in California saying to me, the problem here is someone will come to your Aikido class once and you'll never see them again because they'll be on to the next thing, because there's so many options on a Tuesday evening in San Francisco or, Berlin or Boulder. And we've turned the whole world into that, where there's so many options. And what I love is when someone says, I discovered Michaela Boehm through you, and I've been studying with her for 2 years, or I discovered Jamie McHugh through you, and I've been training with him for 2 years. I really like that. Like that, I feel is kind of like my job in kind of, one of the people anyway in the embodiment space who offers people out on podcasts and events, like the one we've got coming up, and the different events we have, and embodimentunlimited.com for people listening. And we can say like, hey, maybe you'll discover someone that is your teacher there, but I kind of want people to pick teachers. Not many either. Maybe, one meditation teacher, one yoga teacher, one other teacher. Maybe it's not, I don't want people to pick 200 teachers because there's no depth in that.
Right. And there is a way that we can just kind of keep binge eating. Right, certainly we got to metabolize.
We saw that we the first embodiment conference 4 years ago. Daniela and I noticed people making themselves sick by consuming too much, and we actually started giving warnings and saying you might only want to watch 2 or 3 sessions a day, even though we're offering 8. And we were like, hey, watch the recordings. And people were like, hey, is this a marketing trick to buy the recordings? And we were like, no, you will go crazy if you don't take this advice. Because some people couldn't afford the recordings. So they were like, I'm going to watch 8 sessions a day every day. And I was like, that's a shockingly bad idea. And like we realized that it just, particularly because people were coming with different practices in different places with different embodiments. So it's quite disjointed. Because it's not like 8 sessions with 8 Buddhist monks, all from the same temple, which would probably feel quite chill and just be a day of practice. It's like 8 different things with different embodiments. But as you say, one positive is I think it discourages a guru approach, because it used to be you could have a guru, you go to the Brighton Buddhist Center, they're the only Buddhists in town. Whatever they told you about Buddhism was true. That was just how it was. Now you can question what they're saying on YouTube or on podcasts, so you can get other points of view. I remember the first time I saw another teacher's Aikido was actually on VHS. If the kids are listening, that's like a big USB stick. And I remember going, oh, this is totally different than the Aikido I'm studying, which is right. And then sooner or later, I got to travel. I was lucky, not every Aikido person does that. I got to see different teachers, plus the internet became a thing while I was studying Aikido. It wasn't at first. And all of a sudden I realized there was so much out there and I had to find my own style. I had to go, okay, what works for me? And that wouldn't have been the case back in the day. And I think sort of for better and for worse, because maybe people trusted teachers more. Maybe there was a bit of surrender. to teach us, but the modern context discourages gurudom, doesn't it?
Right. Well, I'd say even, it's one of the things I learned about Judaism. I grew up Catholic. I didn't know about Judaism, but Judaism has the tradition of questioning. You're supposed to kind of argue with God. So
who would have thought it? Have you ever met any Israelis? Yeah, there's the kibbutzim, right? They're arguing back and forth. Yeah.
And then I think that's a really healthy tradition. It's, how do we, that fine art of, in a sense, that leap of faith to temporarily just kind of give ourselves over to an experience without that, questioning, judging mind kind of interfering. And then at the same time, being able to step back and really look at it in relationship to other points of view. And I think that's kind of the big challenge, is like not to submit completely and not to resist completely, finding that middle.
Having the French educational system also teaches people to argue culturally. Descartesian, they have a point counterpoint method of education. And, and as you say, it's in Jewish culture. I've worked in Israel about 20 times, and they are two of the hardest places to teach. France, I find a little annoying. The Israelis are great. They ask great questions and there's a humor with it. So it's somehow, I find it more pleasurable there. But it's hard work teaching in Israel, because there's always a yeah, but. And there isn't like I find the Germans quite a good combination, because they'll sort of question things until they commit to something, but they don't do gurus because, history. They don't even like leaders. The German word for leader, it's not a good word. And it's interesting, these different sort of cultural ways of doing things. And there is some healthy balance, isn't there, with if I have a student that has a little bit of what I call basic trust in me, it's way easier than if they're cynical or constantly fighting me like a teenager.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Who needs it?
It's hard work. And they're not getting the most from it. Do you know what I mean?
Who needs it? I don't need it. That's for sure.
But also they're not getting as much as they could because I don't know, I guess it's like, give it a try at least, and there is this pushback against gurus. There's a big program on the BBC at the moment. I'm going to do a piece on it. There's a journalist who done a whole series on gurus, but she defined gurus as anyone who isn't sort of government approved giving information on the internet.
Oh, that's interesting. That's bizarre.
Yeah, it's mainstream media perspective, because me and you aren't government approved. We're not corporate sponsored. Right. We don't have anyone to answer to. We can put whatever we want on the internet. It doesn't cost me much money to make a podcast. You can put your meditations on the website without having to put them by the Jedi Meditation Council. And there's some people that don't like that, because up until fairly the internet, everything was, the BBC is filtered, CNN is filtered. It might have a different filter than Fox, but they both have a filter.
Right. Well, in a sense, the time of the gatekeepers has been kind of exploded, and that's both a positive development and a negative development, right? I mean, there's
it's both, isn't it? New problems.
Right? Yeah. So, as with everything, I mean, that's where, for me, ultimately, somatic practice and the ability to pay attention to our own interior, what's happening, creates a little bit of a bullshit detector, right? I mean,
that's the anti-guru.
If you're constant, right? Yeah,
that's the guru detector, the bullshit detector, right? Like, how does this really land in my body?
Right, and then just how do I feel? And of course, as we know, the human experience is so diverse that different people are going to gravitate towards different teachings. There's some people that just, maybe find like Jamie McHugh, he's from Mars, whatever, and that's okay. I mean, I think what's really important in all of this is that we're all in the stream. We're all in the stream, and there's different currents moving through us in terms of the shoulders that we stand on of who came before, and of course, who's coming after. I mean, I don't know a lot of the young, emergent teachers now.
Kids coming. Jamie, I tell you boomers, you got to move aside, So I'm now. I'm the man now. I used to be on Eve, Jamie. These things happen. You get older, I get middle class.
And that's cool, right? I mean, that we all have our places in that stream, but there's many currents and that will appeal to different people, right? So I don't have the corner on somatic wisdom. I have something that I can offer. And that for me, what's important is the dialogue, the exploration, the working with action as opposed to concepts, right? It's so easy to get lost in the world of concepts because that's how we're trained, and that desire for immediate meaning. But it's like, well, in the here and now, what happens when you drop your breath into your belly? What happens when you bring it up into your chest? What happens when you move it into the back of your body or the front of your body? So the personal inquiry, right? The personal inquiry.
Personal questioning. And because the internet's bigger than any city, there is room for more diversity now. Like in the sense was, San Francisco, big city with a lot of people interested in embodiment, still only had a limited number of approaches because, every teacher would still need some students, some income, some kind of, maybe there's 10 yoga studios in San Francisco. Maybe even, let's say it was 100. It's not 1 million. It's not 1,000 even. But now you could have, like I was explaining this to someone at lunch, and they were saying like, hey, I do, trauma work for pain relief. And I said, that's cool. You can be more specialist than that. And I said, because you're working on the internet. I said, you can do trauma for fibromyalgia, pain relief for mothers, and you'll still have 1,000 students. I was like, who do you love working with? Who are you great at working with? Because you don't have to settle for this group of people will do, or this topic will do. You can get really, really niche. Or niche, you call it in States? And that's you, right? Because you can uber geek out and still make a living.
Right. And I'm kind of like the reverse. I like to spread out because I am curious in the range of responses, right? So I like to have a more generalized approach to kind of open the door to people into the landscape of their own bodies. And so I would say I resist specialization because...
Yes and no, though, Jamie, right? Because you are Jamie McHugh. There's nothing more specialized than being an individual. You have a unique flavor.
Sure.
And your offerings are pretty unique. That's why I reach out to you on the other side of the world. So even though you might like working with different groups and like things that appeal to quite a wide range, me too, by the way, I like, to work with different places, different kinds of people. You are a niche of one in the sense that there's no other Jamie McHugh. And I mean, maybe this is why I wanted to come.
I would hope not.
I'm special and unique in America. That's what every child is told in school. But you, I mean,
what I'm saying though is in terms of specialization. So for me, that is part of the challenge of returning to what I'd call more lateralisation. Specialization can be very, like you're saying, targeted. I work with people with pain, with fibromyalgia, Sure, there can be a broad base of knowledge that informs that. But when I say lateralization in terms of the modern world and specialization, we have meditation, we have movement, we have body work. I mean, we have these very distinct specialized professions. Yep. But in thinking of the body as a holistic medium, contact can also be in relationship to breath and movement. We can keep changing these sensory modalities to liberate different things in ourselves. So, for example, people who might be, and this is a broad brush, but might be drawn to meditation and really being inside and being in stillness, to open the capacity to use their vocal channel and to really bring themselves out into space is a very different experience. So it's for me, it's balancing all of these different forces and channels in the body without over specializing in any of them. So that's what I guess I mean by the lateralisation. And I don't think of myself as a specialist, but of course I'm a specialist in the work of Jamie McHugh. That's true.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And it is a risk of the modern world as we all become so specialist, we lose the big picture. And I've always tried to keep the big picture of embodiment. And especially,
and that's why for me it's important to be an artist as well. So when I shift into the creative act, and for example, like just yesterday, I was out doing photography and sitting under a tree and then exploring sound out in these woods. And then I came back and I began to craft a video out of the images I had just uncovered. That for me, that's kind of like my Sabbath day. It's like letting go of the identity of Jamie McHugh, who does this movement work, into shifting modes of consciousness that informs my practice. My artistic practice informs my work as a somatic movement specialist. So that's for me part of the lateralisation, that we have these practices that are not specifically focused on the work that we do, that we lateralize our experience as a human being.
Yeah, super healthy to have hobbies and interests and loves beyond just the all-encompassing one thing. And I'm tempted to call this episode Meditation as Art, because as well as doing art, being an artist, I mean, you kind of pointed this earlier with vocalization. One of the things I think is pretty unusual about your meditation, I've since heard that it's a little bit more typical in meditation traditionally than on a subtle level than people generally realize. But compared to what most people think of mindfulness as, you sort of sit there and watch something passively.
Right?
You're sort of receptive, you're paying attention, but you're not doing much. And your way of doing things, as I've experienced, it's much more active. You work with touch, which I've very rarely heard a meditation teacher encourage to do. Vocalization during meditation. Again, much easier on Zoom when everyone's not in the same room, right?
Right.
But that is nice. Movement. What have I missed? There's a few others, these sort of tools that you use, aren't they, in a much more active way?
And even the kind of the innovations with breathing. So there's kind of like a premium on letting the breath be what it is. It's like, well, let the breath be what it is. Experiment a little bit, then let the breath be what it is. So this, I would say it's a more active process. I like to call it the art of lively stillness. Because, there's, I don't know if you also know the teacher, Buddhist teacher, Will Johnson. Nope. He used to be a Rolfer, but, he really, I mean, his message is, we're not designed to be Buddhist statues. We're not designed to be frozen bodies, and that we can think of meditation in that way, that the body is constantly being informed by the stream of information. So when I read his book, it was like, right on, this is what I've been doing in my own way, but I'm approaching stillness without the umbrella of Buddhism. I like to think that I am offering secular stillness, or I would, or more organic. I mean, to become breathing rock, that there is a sense of gravitas in a big boulder. And how can we settle in our structure and also be aware of the inner movement that's happening, participate with it? Because otherwise, I mean, let's face it, with the proliferation of so much going on, to all of a sudden sit down and think that I'm just going to watch my breath, I'd rather shoot myself. I mean, in terms of, there's got to be a landing in that experience of stillness that's not so rigorous and what I'd call over cerebralization of what I'm supposed to experience rather than how do I begin to decelerate, land in myself, take a little pressure off my chest, land a little bit more, maybe bring a little more awareness to parts of my body, land a little bit more, so that this practice of lively stillness is actually recalibrating our rhythm from out there to in here without kind of hard and fast rules. And that's why I like to teach people a wide range of resources. It's like I like to say, if you have 20 different ways you know how to breathe, then you have flexibility. Then you have
creativity
choice.
possible there. And
absolutely.
I just did an episode, just a solo one on what I call intermediate meditation. Because it used to be that I used to teach and no one knew what meditation was. And now most people in coaching and yoga, and even civilians, in business, they know what meditation is. They've maybe done it a bit with an app, but they're not very skilled at it in that they've kind of been taught a technique, watch your breath. If your mind drifts, watch your breath some more. And that's fine. It's not bad. Because often they've been taught by well-meaningful people who maybe didn't have a huge amount of knowledge. Even some of the famous American baby boomer teachers, they might have only been in Asia for 6 months, with language barriers,
Right.
And actually what I've learned studying traditional Buddhism in a bit more depth is, for example, working with the breath actively to reduce what they call the hindrances is an absolutely classical part of Buddhist meditation. And, working with visualizations is absolutely a part of Tibetan meditation. Right. And these things are not, they're not quite as active in yours, and you probably have a greater toolkit than most, but they're certainly part of the sort of, once you're no longer a complete beginner in Buddhist meditation, it's expected you be a little bit more active to, I've heard analogies like tune the guitar string, to keep yourself awake, to make yourself calm, to work with hindrances of anger or whatever as they arise. And that's not passive. That is a creative act.
Yeah. No, I'm glad you highlighted that, the whole notion of the creative aspect, because of course the creative aspect really boils down to it is each person's uniqueness, right? And so in that sense of one size doesn't fit all, that we're all unique, we're all at different places in our incarnation. It's important for me, at least as a guide and a teacher, to give people choices. It's like, if this doesn't work, try this, try this, try this, and then return to what was difficult before and see how it is now. And that in that way, that there is that agency that's automatically given to people to chart their own way. Because I've had
many creative, it's agentic, isn't it? It's like,
yeah, absolutely. And that is creative.
Choices, so I can't just do what the guru says because they're sitting over here and I've got to make choices here.
Right. And that is, for me, fundamental to that individual empowerment. And of course, the more permission we give ourselves, then ultimately, the more allowance we will give to others. And that, for me, is very fundamental in how we think about the latitude of human experience and what we can all profit from.
It's interesting, when we teach meditation or any embodied art, I always thought we're teaching on two levels. There's the technique, like I could learn working with vocalization from Jamie McHugh, and people can download some of your nice podcasts from your website, and then they'll learn some new techniques that most meditators don't know, and I highly recommend it. But then there's also like, what are you teaching within the technique? Like the whole idea of, the natural world being important, or agency, or uniqueness. Like there's a whole nother set of things that are taught implicitly by how we teach what we teach.
Right. No, I agree. There is and this is kind of the interesting thing I've been thinking a lot about, is when I guide people into this more receptive state, right? Slowing down, breathing. I realized that there is a danger there because there can be an element of brainwashing when people are receptive.
Your voice is quite hypnotic, Jamie.
Right. Right. Well, and I really want to kind of, so I'm very conscious of not adding belief systems
just drop
to
in
my
a
guiding.
voting preference in there or something.
Right. Well, because I think it's really, because I have, kind of noticed, kind of in different guided meditations, people giving this kind of input. And it's like, these are belief systems.
Yes.
Just tell me what to do. Let me kind of go and meet my body on its own terms. Let me get a feeling for that expansiveness of breath or this or that. But don't add dogma, because that is implicitly dangerous, I think, in terms of, because if I'm asking people to kind of
in that way,
well, right, because if I'm asking people to surrender their ordinary defenses in that moment of guiding, I have to be very mindful of just the bare bones here. I'm offering the bare bones so you can have an experience, but it is not dogma related.
This, unfortunately, a lot of the big meditation teachers from the States are dropping in a lot of their politics, particularly on the West Coast centers, less on the East Coast centers. They've become sort of politically polarized, and they assume that all their students are from sort of further left than Democrats generally are. And that's not the case, that all their students are from there, nor should their students have to be. Like, I'm imagining some Republican farmer from the Midwest who's a perfectly decent human being. He's a perfectly kind, generous man, but may not share my politics, let alone someone in, Eslands or whatever. And I worry that he can't attend the meditation. I heard a British senior monk the other day make a comment about Brexit in one of his talks. And I just thought, I actually happen to agree with his view. But I was very uncomfortable with the fact that after a meditation on a retreat, because it was a recording from, it sort of just been dropped in there. And I went, did you just alienate 10% of your audience who, I mean, leading them towards kindness is probably enough.
Right.
And then they might have a view that comes out of that.
Right. And I think that that's really kind of the challenge. And that's where the Buddhist concept of refraining, I think, is very important. It's like, how do we, right? But also just, I think it's important that people have their points of view. I'm just saying that in my work, I'm conscious of providing an experience that then people report on, right? What their first person experience was, without getting into a lot of excessive verbiage, and using that as an opportunity to highlight for the assembled group some of, kind of basic somatic principles, or so to kind of enlarge the conversation beyond our personal experience. So for me, that holding the space for individual experience and exploration, as well as kind of looking at the collective, is really just very nourishing, and how people can bring forward different aspects from their own experience that really creates a kind of a whole ecosystem that everybody can dip into. And as long as it's just kind of based around that, I feel like, okay, I'm doing my job. I'm doing my job. I'm giving a reflective aspect as well as an experiential aspect, and that we're all starting from the same kind of ground of basic activity, which I think is just, for me, that's enough.
Anything else as we sort of move towards closure? Is there anything else kind of you're super excited about right now, or anything else from your, people might expect from your classes in terms of the structure that might be a bit different?
Partly, I think what I'm excited about, well, in the here and now, is besides, kind of a new round of classes beginning next week, is I'm going to be going to Europe in May and June and doing some on land workshops again, and which I haven't done for 4 years, since 2019, pre-pandemic.
Switzerland's a hell of a place to do it. I think it's one of the most beautiful countries in Europe. So
so I'll be in Switzerland. I'll be in France, trying to line something up in England. So just a variety, but I've been missing being in the consciousness of Europe for a while. I love moving around
I'm often hard on America, but actually I wouldn't do what I do now had I not got that American enthusiasm and can-do and entrepreneurial. My sort of mixture of Jewish teachers and American teachers really helped me a lot. So I want to say that because I'm sometimes a little hard on America, and because it's such a dominant force in this world, in somatics as well as in the wider world. But what do you miss about Europe? Like what is it that you long for, or that adds something?
What I find, because I've been teaching in Europe since '89, so kind of back and forth. I lived there for a couple of years in Switzerland, '96 to '98, had long-standing groups, is that there is a way of life that feels much simpler. There's a value on vacation time. People in the United States are lucky if they get 2 weeks of vacation a year. It's just
the French will take all of August off. The Italians,
right? Exactly. So there is a quality of life experience that I find just awesome. I love traveling on the trains. I love having just that way of moving through the world. I like the scale. There's something in all of those different cultures that I find kind of enlivening, and I find the kind of the hyped upness of the American experience to be it's kind of incompatible with the way I live. We live rurally here. We live, out in the countryside. We're close to towns. I'm a 2-hour train ride to New York City, which is awesome to kind of dip in and then just get away. But I like the slower frequency, and so it is a quality of life experience, particularly on the human domain, that I find interesting.
I find that in Southern Europe very much. In Portugal, other places I've been, community aspect. I guess something about not being sold to as a default. I find sometimes in America, everyone's got an angle.
That's great.
I spoke to a really cool, interesting embodiment guy on the phone yesterday. I had a lot, private call with a guy doing cool stuff, and I felt like my defenses had to be up a little bit because I was being sold to. And when that's not there, you can just drop that, and somehow it's more vulnerable, more open, more connecting,
Right. It's the entrepreneurial trap, and that there's a whole industry based around that, and get yourself a coach who can show you XYZ to promote yourself on social. It's just find it a little, I get it. It can unfortunately be disingenuous and prepackaged, and whatever the zeitgeist is offering.
America feels performative to me, and sometimes in a good way, not always bad. It feels like a movie. Actors that you can tell are actors. Whereas,
we had a president who was an actor, Ronald Reagan.
He was literally an actor, wasn't he? Quite funny as well, I've recently discovered. I never much liked his politics, but I found him quite amusing. He tells some very good jokes about communism, so I've been pursuing those to amuse my wife. But and the positive side of that, you should say something positive side of that, is that entrepreneurship, that can do that, I'm going to make something and then sell it. that's so often lacking from Europe. There's so few European teachers I can get on. And I was talking to a really cool movement teacher today in London. He was really reluctant to come on the podcast. And like, whereas, we've got this event coming up, and several Americans have messaged me to say, hey, I'd love a slot to speak at this conference. And that's just not something British people, let alone Germans, would do.
Right.
And it's kind of sad. Like, I feel like that's a problem here as well, that we're not quite putting our foot forward that way.
Well, you have your long-standing traditions in history that on one level I think are very grounding and attractive. And at the same time, in the United States is the land of reinvention. And our lack of traditions and really creates a lot of ungrounding. So there is some happy medium between how do we have traditions and, in a sense, really feel the grounding of time and space, and at the same time are able to innovate. It's like Emilie Conrad, who created Continuum, said, she said, my work never could have happened in Europe, right? In LA.
It's stagnant in a way. There's a pub across the road that's older than your country.
Exactly.
This desk that my laptop's on looks like a couple of 100 years old. There's bars. There's a few things in this room. I'm in a nice old Airbnb, like classical British one. It's tradition, but boy, it comes with it's a weight around your neck as well. Listen, Jamie, we've got to wrap up. Where do people find you on the interweb? Some of these cool meditations and classes and art we've been talking about. Where do they go?
So they go to www.somatic-expression.com. And my other website is naturebeingart.org. Naturebeingart.org.
Well, we'll put you out there. It's nice to see you again, Jamie. Thank you very much.
Great to see you too.
Well, Walsh here. If you like that, you'll probably like embodimentunlimited.com and our app. So on both of these things, you can get a bunch of podcasts that aren't available here, some exclusive ones with some big names, some people you'll probably recognize that are over there. There's a copy of my book, PDF of my first book on embodiment, which seems to people like. I sold quite a few copies on Amazon, but there's a free copy there. What else is there? Loads of videos of me coaching embodiment, resources on trauma, on meditation, on yoga. And you can also chat to people without going on Facebook or any of that nonsense. So if you want to chat embodiment people, that's there. And it's on the embodimentunlimited.com, all free, and the app available at the App Store and all that good stuff. So if you like this, do check those out.